On the 11th of February, Guild Wars 2 got a new balance patch. And today I want to talk about every single build that is affected by that, and I'm especially talking also about builds that I already released videos about on my channel. So be sure to stick around for the whole video to see every single change and how it might affect your gameplay. This video is split into sections, so if you're only interested in PvE, skip to the corresponding section, and of course if you're only interested in a specific build that I released already, also skip to the corresponding section. And with that out of the way, let's jump right in. If I don't mention a class, that always means it is not affected actively by the patch. Of course the meta might change and that might bring classes that did not get any buffs or nerfs still in a different spot, but I will talk about only the big changes. So I will start with PvP. So let's start that Willbender got nerfed, the spear got a little bit gutted. That is fine. I think the damage on spear was very good. You can still run the build. It's now more viable to run greatsword as well instead of spear. Both versions are still very, very solid. It might just not be as broken as it was once before. When it comes to Condi Herald got nerfed a bit as well. However, I would say it's definitely deserved and it's still very, very solid. So don't worry, you can still run this build. On the other end, Power Herald is actually quite decent now, so it's a very good power build. It might struggle with another build that is coming up, which is the Power Mirage, which is a really, really powerhouse right now because it got buffed with a 10% damage buff, which is insane. It was already good before the patch and now it's the best build currently for Aroma. So that's the other build that I want to mention. It's really, really good right now. Prot Holo is on paper viable right now. So a Holosmith build that uses a lot of protection and cleansing. It might still struggle against a good Mirage, so let's see how the meta turns out to be in the end. But I think this is definitely a build I would be ready to play if you're Holosmith enjoyer. Then we got some spear buffs to Ranger. I would say the most impactful one is for Untamed. I think the Untamed uses spear really good and therefore it might get meta again. And I think Untamed is a really nice spec for a lot of people because it's very challenging to play and it's very fun. So I think this is a good direction. Other than that, Thief did not get a lot of buffs and changes for PvP, only a small buff to Spectre, so I think Spectre might still be a very good pick if you're Spectre enjoyer, but I think it's not a meta pick. Big nerfs to Support Chrono. I already mentioned that in a previous video. I think the changes to how the boon application works make it way worse. It's still a very good support, but it's not S tier support in my opinion anymore. At least if you have Tempest, I think Tempest is slightly better now. It's still playable, don't get me wrong. If you're playing ranked and stuff, it's still very worth it, but I think it is definitely a little bit less than it used to be. Then we have Tempest. Big nerf to the side-noting Sage build. I think it's still viable. It's not as oppressive anymore as in the tankiness. So I think you can still play it, but just be aware that it's not that strong anymore. Tempest support is completely untouched. When it comes to Dagger, especially Catalyst, got nerfed as well. I would say you don't run that build anymore. You typically run now Hammer Catalyst, which is way better. You run Staunch Arrows instead of the Sphere Specialist trade, and it's actually very decent. It's probably the best side note right now. And then lastly, we got a small nerf to Harbinger in PvP, but it's definitely still playable. The Blood one with Spear is actually a really good build right now. So that covers PvP for now. So PvE, I tried to include some benchmarks as well to make sure that you understand how it looks, the current situation. But of course, there are preliminary benchmarks. We are 2 days after the patch, so that means there will be some changes in the future, but this is probably how it turns out a little bit very close to this. So let's start with Guardian. Dragon Hunter got some big buffs. It's now at 43k bench, which is really good. It has a nice burst. It has a really interesting build with longbow or with spear. Both work. It's really fun. Really good build now for raiding as a power build. And Berserker got some really nice buffs to the Condi build. Weakness or the Condi DPS build, and they are both really good right now. So I would say if you're an enjoyer of longbow, this is the way to go. Bladestone is now better, but I'm not sure if it's so much better that people will go back to Bladestone. So let's see. I don't have any benches there. When it comes to Revenant, I would say Herald was big changes here. DPS Herald is now at 36.8k bench, but it uses Sword, Greatsword. And that means that if you want to go with, for example, CC or something, or only the easier build with only swords, you're at only 30k, so that's not that good. So the DPS build is easy a little bit, but it's definitely not a crazy good DPS build. The quick DPS build got nerfed quite a bit, so it's definitely lower in DPS. You can still play it. It's a really good build still from the boon axis, but from the DPS side, it's definitely of the lower end from the quickness DPS builds. Renegade, not that much changed, and Vindicator as well, so a little bit better, but not too crazy. Let's talk about Engineer next. Engineer got a small buff to Scrapper. That's really nice convenience. So really good. Mechanist is now at 45k Condi DPS with Spear. It's a really good build. If you enjoy Mechanist or Condi builds, this is a really good pick. One of the highest benchmarks right now. And Ranger has a 44.2k benchmark as a Soul Beast with Spear. As a DPS build, this is really, really good. Really high DPS, high burst damage, probably one of the best power builds to play right now, just because of the high burst potential, which is really good for phases. Untamed, you can play as a really good quickness DPS now with Spear at 36k, really good build right now. When it comes to Thief, nothing changed in PvE, except that the Heal Spectre got buffed, so if you play some kind of support Spectre, you are better off now. Virtuoso got big nerfs. Condi Virtuoso and Power Virtuoso both go down. We don't know exactly how much yet, but I think it's between 1 to 3k for both builds, something like that. They are still viable, don't worry, but the DPS is definitely lower. When it comes to Mirage, Mirage actually get a power build now. You can play it as a power DPS, which is a little bit hard to play. If you reach the highest that you currently can get is around 43k, which is a very decent power DPS benchmark. And then we have Chronomancer. The quick DPS Chronomancer build, or Alacrity for that matter, got it down to 35k, which is still a very good number, but it's not as good as before. So if you played it for the DPS, you might switch to, for example, Quickness Untamed. The heal Chronomancer did not get changed at all. Yes, there are some changes to how you apply protection, but in the end you end up with the same. You just have to be a little bit aware of that. And then we have Elementalist. The big nerfs to Tempest, Fresh Air, Scepter build, for example, 3 to 4k DPS loss, really big. When it comes to the Alacrity heal, you now play with Warhorn, which is a really nice buff. So Alacrity heal Tempest is really good. Catalyst can now play a really decent Spear build with less DPS, but more consistency. So I think this is the better way to go. So it is still a very valuable. The Sphere got a bit nerfed with the boon access, but that's fine. Necromancer didn't get changed at all in PvE. Let's now jump to World vs. World. World vs. World, we have Willbender, which is nerfed in roaming, definitely way worse there. It is still playable for sure, but not as good anymore because it got big nerfs to mobility. Firebrand is still very decent in Zerg play, so nothing changed there even after the nerfs. Power Roamer as Herald is actually back, so I think Power Herald roaming is one of the best roaming builds right now. It's very fun, it's very skillful, be sure to check it out. Renegade sadly is completely dead in Zerg play. It was really strong, but it got so many nerfs now, I think it's not playable anymore. Hater is a little bit worse than before. You can still play it in contrast to Renegade, but it's definitely worse. I think all the supports got nerfed, so we will see how that turns out. But I think Vindicator is definitely one of the ones that is still usable. Scrapper, again, also nerfed, but still meta. Druid nerfed, and I think actually quite hard nerfed, so I would say Druid might be a little bit worse off than before. But let's see how the supports turn out in Zerg play. I would say a Spear Untamed Roamer is now viable. It's really, really good. It's a really good roaming build, especially with the spear buffs, so be sure to check that out if you want. Daredevil and Deadeye, which are a little bit worse in roaming, but they're still completely playable. Don't worry. Even with the big nerfs that they got, they are still a really big menace when it comes to roaming, just because of the innate stealth stuff that Thief has. I would say Spectre is better in Zerg play, but in roaming it's not that much changed. Yeah, let's say Virtuoso is still very decent in Zerg play, and of course in roaming as well, even with the small nerf to the F1 skill. But Chronomancer is actually quite big nerf when it comes to Zerg play. I think they actually did really hard nerfs to Chronomancer. I'm not sure if you can still run the support Chronomancer after this. I think it's still viable, but it's definitely way worse, so be aware that you might have to switch to another support. When it comes to Mirage, Mirage is way better in roaming, and also a really good pick now for example, Greatsword Mirage in Zerg play. And then Elementalist, definitely a big nerf to Tempest. I think in Zerg play, it's definitely not as common anymore. It's probably not meta anymore. And in roaming, Catalyst is actually also changed to Hammer instead of Dagger. So that's the big nerf there. And Necromancer, I would say, Power Reaper for Zerg play is probably meta again, which is interesting. before it was Scourge. That's because Scourge is actually really hard gutted. I think it's not playable anymore as a really top-end support. So now to my builds. I want to talk about all the builds that I released that are affected. If I don't mention a build, that means it's not affected at all. I will also mention solo builds and not PvE builds only, so for raid content, but also the solo builds. And I will start with the solo builds. So we got slight nerfs, like I mentioned already, in the cutter boon access. That doesn't mean that the build that I showed is not viable anymore. It's perfectly fine. You have so high boon duration and should not be affected. The Virtuoso and the Chrono that I showed lose a little bit in the DPS compartment, but they are still completely fine. You can completely run the same build. You will probably not notice a big difference. We got a slight buff actually to the Mechanist build with Spear. So now it's a bit higher in the DPS side, so very nice there. But other than that, all the solo builds are completely playable and no big changes at all. So don't worry. When it comes to PvP, like I said, we have slight nerfs to Spear Herald, Sage Tempest, Dagger Catalyst. They are all still playable, but definitely a bit worse. I would say Dagger Catalyst is the worst of them. I think they should run Hammer instead. Willbender, Power Harp, and Support Chrono got nerfed decent amount, but still completely fine. However, Support Chrono, I would say, might not be the best support anymore. Let's see. Spear Rival Chronomancer, which is the really offensive Chronomancer build, is actually not playable anymore. I would say the boon access is too low to make it really worth it. When it comes to buffs, we got some nice Hammer buffs for Catalyst, so Staunch Auras in particular. So that would be the change to the Hammer side nodding build. You run now Staunch Auras instead of Sphere Catalyst, and slight buffs to Spectre, and of course Spear Mirage. If you want to see how to play Spear Mirage, there will be a new video very soon, so don't miss out on that. And then let's talk about World vs. World builds. So like I said, Dagger Catalyst will probably swap to Hammer Catalyst as a meta build for roaming as well. We have Staff Tempest, which is my really go-to build before the patch, which is sadly now not as strong anymore as a support, just because of all the nerfs to the Rivers Relic, for example. And Spear Willbender for roaming is definitely way worse. I would say it's not as oppressive anymore. We got a slight buff to Spear Mirage, so that is actually a really good roaming build right now. It's one of the better ones. It's very squishy still, but has a lot of damage potential, so be sure to check that out if you want to have some kind of build like that. And then let's talk about the instance content PvE builds. So I released a guide about Boom Chronomancer. The DPS is down, but you can still use the same here. The same goes for the Healing Chronomancer. Same thing. Here is exactly the same. For Conde Virtuoso, use the same here. You just have lower DPS. And the same goes for Power Virtuoso. Use the same here, but you have lower DPS. Which is totally fine. They were both really overperforming in that sense. But you can still use them. They are still completely viable. And the gear is exactly the same. For the quick DPS, Herald, the DPS is down, but you use the same gear. Again, it's fine. I think this build is still very viable. Just that you know the DPS is a little bit lower now. We got a slight buff to the DPS mech with Spear. So you use the same gear, you just are better off with a little bit more DPS. I guess that's perfectly fine. And then the last thing that I made a build guide about is the Alacrity Healing Tempest. You now use Warhorn way more efficiently in the offhand, just because it's really good now. It has more boons and it is a little bit more user friendly. So big buff to this. Other than that, all the builds are unchanged, or most of the builds that I mentioned here are actually playable. There are not a lot of builds that really got gutted so much that you can't play them anymore. So I hope you found this quick guide helpful. If you did, be sure to leave a like. Let me know your take on this matter in the comments. And if you want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe. I would really appreciate it. Thanks a lot for the support on Patreon, YouTube and Twitch. Thanks Timo, thanks Malice, and I hope to see you all in the next video.